All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to HRPP's Research Matters. I'm Erica Salzik, the Department Administrator for HRPP's Human Research Protection Program, and I'll be one of the moderators for today's session. I'm going to go over some housekeeping items quickly. So first, if you have any questions for our presenters, please type them in the Q&A and one of the moderators will respond to you during the session, or we will address it at the end of the presentation. This session is being recorded and you can watch it again right after it's finished by clicking on the Microsoft Teams Live link in the email invitation. We'll also send you the slides via email. You can find the links to future meetings, slides, handouts, and past recordings on HRPP's Research Matters website, which is under the Training and Resources page. We do provide a certificate of attendance for those who have logged in using a valid email address. If you do not receive one via email but should have, please send an email to hrpp@utsouthwestern.edu to request a certificate. And lastly, we want to hear from you. So we're always interested to know what topics you would like us to cover during these sessions. How did our speakers do and how our office is doing? So please take a few minutes to complete the survey to provide feedback. You may access the survey using your phone via the QR code here on the screen, or by selecting the link from the computer, which I'll drop the link for the survey in the Q&A in just a moment. So here's our agenda for today. Today we have a presentation from our Quality Assurance and Monitoring Office. Daryl Campbell-Pierre will discuss the importance of maintaining essential documentation for the study team's regulatory binders. And then we will hear from Maya Bird for an overview of when IRB approval is necessary and the IRB requirements when using artificial intelligence in human subject research. And as always, if we have time, we'll conclude with an open Q&A session. So now I'm going to turn it over to Daryl.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daryl Campbell-Pierre. I am a regulatory monitoring analyst with the Quality Assurance Monitoring team. Today, I will briefly present the essential documentation practices for maintaining your regulatory binder. I'll begin my presentation by addressing why regulatory documentation is important to maintain in every research study. Regulatory documents are also known as essential documents, which is documents that are evidence that demonstrates that your study team meets investigator, sponsor, and monitoring good clinical practice standards. For these essential documents, it ensures that your regulatory requirements are hitting the expectation for each study. This is important because the essential documents ensures that you are regulatory compliant. If you are not regulatory compliant, this can lead to some significant risks for your studies and for the organization, such as fines, reputation damage, lawsuits, or even study shutdown. Having an appropriate documentation practice for your regulatory documentation helps ensure the safety of patients that are taking the time to participate in different studies across campus. And when the quality assurance monitoring team randomly selects studies, our monitoring team prioritize looking at all of your essential documentation and providing internal support to ensure that the study team is regulatory compliant. Prior to our reviews, we take the time to look at each study's individual to discover what documentation requirements are needed based on the determination given for the study, which can fall under two different categories, also known as minimal risk studies and greater than minimal risk studies. Now we're going to look at the two different determinations of these study groups, starting with the required documents for minimal risk studies. When we do our reviews, we're going to look at making sure that you have the current protocol that your study is operating under, looking at CVs, medical license, GCP, and HCP certifications, Looking at different study logs like adverse event logs, protocol deviation logs, study enrollment logs, looking at these different documents that are required for the minimal risk. We'll also look at IRB documents that include initial IRB approvals, initial IRB submissions, and any other IRB notifications and investigator responses from the IRB. We're going to look at data collection documents. These consist of case report forms or any templates that are used to collect data when you are collecting data to meet the study collection criteria. For your lab documentation, this includes laboratory certifications, lab director CVs, or even normal lab reference values as well. The source documentation are kept for the subject source documentation, where we will look at different eligibility criteria checklists, signed and dated consent forms, even case report forms and EPIC research notes to close up your source documentation for the minimal risk. The minimal risk and greater than minimal risk are very similar, but there are some more documents that need to be evaluated when we're looking at a greater than minimal risk study. There's two things that I want to touch on today. Those two things that are different from minimal risk studies with the greater than minimal risk studies are the Form FDA 15, which are for sponsor studies, and a 1571, which is a required document for initial IND submission and for each subpoint submission to the IND as well. For greater than minimal risk studies, we will also need to be looking at the assigned investigators brochure along with the protocol. Again. Sorry. Now, to ensure that your study team are practicing healthy habits when maintaining your regulatory documents, I have composed a 5 organization strategies which begins with identifying key goals that are going to help guide your organization system for your essential documents. Make sure that you're planning out what goals you want to hit to be able to maintain your regulatory documents, and so that your study team can be able to move forward to attack these different action items. The next strategy is develop a process that works for your study team. If that's a process, the main key component is that you want to make sure that you have a process that your study team can adhere to. If you have a step-by-step process to be able to maintain your goals, that will lead you into the right direction to make sure you have all of this regulatory documents that are needed for your study. The next organization strategy is meet regularly as a study team. These are sensitive documents, and you want to make sure that you have transparent communication between everybody on the study team so you can hold each other accountable as you are containing and maintaining these regulatory documents. The next strategy is take your time and be intentional with all your essential documents. You want to make sure that you are taking a few extra minutes just to review the documents when you're filing into your regulatory binders or subject binders. But just know that this time and effort is going to be great for you as you're building a healthy relationship with maintaining your regulatory documentation. And finally, you can contact the Quality Assurance Monitoring Team if you need guidance. We now participate in the HRPPO office hours twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 a.m. to 11. You can come, ask your questions. We'll be able to help guide you in the questions that you need answered and find solutions for your study team. When the Quality Assurance Monitoring Team schedules a monitoring visit with your study team, when you're randomly selected, we provide each study team with a checklist that matches their study determination, whether that is minimal risk or greater than minimal risk. Using these checklists can be other strategies that you can use to cross-reference between the regulatory documents that you have and check on the status of those regulatory documents prior to our monitoring visit. If you and your study team would like a checklist you can use to incorporate to look over your essential documents, you can please reach out to any member on the Quality Assurance Monitoring Team. We'll be able to happy to give you this checklist, so therefore you can cross-reference with your documentation. Next, I wanted to provide some information on the expectation for clinical trials to maintain their regulatory documentation via eFlorence according to the Florence Regulatory Management System Requirement SOP. Particularly Section 4.2.1 states that study determination to be a clinical trial per NIH OHRP definition outlined in Section 3 are required to use Florence e-regulatory management system from as beginning in January 1st, 2023. This means that all clinical trials need to be transferred to eFlorence, so therefore we can adhere to the SOP that has been stated. I have provided a link for you to review. Also, if you have any questions, we'll be happy to provide this link for you in the chat as well. In conclusion, essential documents is a vital piece to the research process. You want to make sure that we are maintaining the essential documents that are needed for your study, so therefore we can be compliant on every step of the way throughout the research process. I want everyone to know that there are resources and strategies internally to help you become more efficient when maintaining your regulatory documents so that you can make sure that your study is being compliant at all times. And lastly, if you have any questions, please join HRPP's office hours every Tuesday and Thursday from 10 a.m. to 11, and a representative from the QA team will be happy to help you as well. Thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to Meg.
Thank you, Daryl. Let me work on getting my screen shared. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Before I get into today's presentation, I wanted just to mention one quick update that I had on our website. We have updated the informed consent documents. This was something we had worked on last year, but we finally have pushed out to the online portion, is the updates to the language to include more gender neutral information in terms. And then we've made an update to the radiation risk information, or the template language on the radiation risk language. So without more information on that, I'm going to go ahead and go over to the presentation for today. So today I'm going to talk about guidance on use of artificial intelligence and human subjects research. I know this has kind of been a much anticipated topic, especially because our current eIRB system really doesn't have a good place to document information that's necessary to make IRB determinations whenever studies are using artificial intelligence. So before we start, let me go ahead and go over definitions. So when we're talking about artificial intelligence, or AI, this is the science and engineering of making intelligent machines or intelligent computer programs. Artificial intelligence, or AI, uses different techniques. They could be based on statistical analysis of data. They can be systems where, excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold, so sorry for clearing my throat here. There can be systems that are based on if-then statements, and then in turn, we can also use machine learning. Machine learning, on the other hand, is a technique of artificial intelligence that can be used to design and train software algorithms to learn from and act on data. When we're talking about machine learning can be systems that are kind of locked in place, where they are set in place and they act consistently over time, or they can be adaptive, such that based on information that's being put into the system itself, it can learn and change and adapt over time. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence as like software, because this will be more important as we talk about something later on in the presentation. So when is IRB review required? The two regulations that kind of come in mind, and you'll probably hear this in a lot of our presentations, are the regulations. So the first regulation that we want to take into consideration is the FDA's 21 CFR 56, specifically looking at clinical evaluations and investigations of devices. This also includes early feasibility studies. The other regulation that we take into consideration is OHARPS 45 CFR 46. When we're thinking about use of artificial learning or software, so to speak, in studies, we want to focus on whether that particular regulation is applicable, and it would be in situations where there's interaction, intervention, or when you're using, analyzing, generating identifiable information. So some criteria that we can kind of consider when we're thinking about those two regulations. One of the first things is obviously when we're talking about the software use, is it determined or is it defined as a medical device according to the FDA? We can ask the question of whether the activities involving the software, is it research, whether it involves human subjects, and then can it be determined as exempt? And for the purpose of the presentation, we're not talking about exempt from IRB review. We're talking about the exempt category, which is a carve out in the regulations that 45 CFR 46 specifically, that indicate that most of the requirements of the federal policy for protection of human subjects is not applicable. Again, not exempt from IRB review, exempt from a lot of those federal regulations. So when we're talking about what a medical device is, there's lots of guidance on the FDA website on making determinations of when a device is considered a medical device. I actually used this with staff just yesterday. We went through a scenario on whether the software could be considered a medical device. It's very helpful software or helpful decision trees at the FDA's website, but specifically the FDA is looking at medical devices as software that's intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that performs the purposes without being part of like some type of hardware system. And in those situations, because it's a medical device and it's defined as such, IRB review would be required. And it cannot be exempt under the FDA regulations, meaning an exempt determination can be made if a medical device is being used. Now, in talking about whether the activity involved in the software is research, we always go back to our definition of research. So that's presented by OHARP. Research is a systematic investigation, including development, testing, evaluation, that's designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. We all know systematic investigation is going to be like a careful inquiry or an examination of information or systems, a plan or a method. And generalizable knowledge is information that's widely applicable. When we talk about widely applicable, it's information or it's something that we can apply to like a larger population or results that are going to be intended to use, develop, or test or support theories, principles, statements of relationships to inform policy beyond the study. When we're talking about non-generalizable AI or software, so typically its intended use of the algorithm is limited to like the application or the original data set. Well, when we're talking about more generalizable software or AI, the software is intended to be built as a tool to be applied to a broader population or on information that has not been collected yet. Next, we evaluate, does it involve or does the research involve human subjects? We go on to use OHARP's definition of human subjects, and they go define that a human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator, when we talk about whether they're professional or student, is conducting research. And I'll kind of refer to the second definition because that refers more to AI, where you're obtaining, using, studying, analyzing, generating identifiable private information. So typically it's going to involve human subjects because there's some type of input of medical record information or information from about humans that you're putting into the AI tool that is going to be used to develop the tool itself so it can function the way you need it to. And is it exempt? I think, as I mentioned before, exempt again refers to the exempt carve out in the regulations. Medical devices, if they're being used on a study, again, when they're determined to meet the definition of a medical device, the study itself can't be exempt from the regulations. I'll talk a little bit now of some situations where IRB approval would not be required. The first step is evidence-based practice or non-investigational software. So this is going to be the use of evidence-based models that are parts of standard of care, where there's not any type of question that's going to be answered. You're basically just using these models in a standard of care setting. They're non-interventional. There's really no questions about it. You're just using it to carry out healthcare. Another instance would be quality improvement. So if there's some type of like I don't know, machine or algorithm or something that's going to help improve quality in clinical workflows, healthcare delivery, and quality, that would be another instance where we can say that IRB approval is not required. Another instance would be like there's a limited use, where the usefulness of the software itself is limited to like a department, a unit, or a clinic. I can tell you from an IRB office standpoint, sometimes we develop like we use a Word document and we create like macros. So like when you push a button, there's certain language that gets put into like a paragraph. And obviously we've got to format it, but that to me would be like some type of software that we're using internally, but it's only specific to our department. We're not sharing it. We're not testing the efficacy of it or anything like that. Another example would be something that's developed by a practitioner, but it's really going to be solely for their use and they're not sharing the use of that particular software. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about are IRB considerations and protocol details. And you'll see that this slide is pretty busy, but I'm going to go over it slowly. So when we're talking about IRB considerations and protocol details, the IRB does take into consideration there's regulatory criteria for IRB approval. And from that regulatory criteria for approval, when we're involving software, we want to take out some of those criteria for approval and hone in on some key components that will help the IRB make the appropriate determinations. One of those is determining whether the selection of subjects is equitable. So we want to make sure that the protocol is including a population that's going to be affected by the findings of the use of that software. The data sets itself should be large and diverse for the targeted population. And you want to make sure that you're avoiding unnecessary inclusion-exclusion criteria of certain groups due to inconvenience. When we talk about informed consent, this might be a situation where you get informed consent or it might not be. If you're using medical record information or information that was collected as part of another research study, like secondary use, basically, when you're using that information, was informed consent obtained for the use that you're going to use in this particular manner or for some type of future unknown research? We want to make sure that if there are laws that prevent or protect certain types of data or images, that you take those into consideration with your policy and to have ways to either avoid or indicate a way and a manner that you're going to obtain that information, all by abiding by that particular law. Namely, we have like NDI, National Dex Index, data, we've got mental health information, HIV, or sometimes we deal with incriminating data. We can also consider whether a waiver of consent is appropriate. Obviously, there's criteria that must be met for waiver of consent. For software protocols, we're looking at data monitoring. We want to look at how your model iterations, data shifting. We want to you want to make sure that you're including like post-deployment monitoring to identify harms. So obviously, with our current computer system, we run every day, and occasionally there's a glitch. Occasionally there's something that goes wrong in coding and it causes an issue. So, what is your plan when things like that occur, or hiccups or hallucinations occur in software, so that you can kind of mitigate biases, mitigate those issues, and so that they don't have an impact on, your patients or some unintended outcomes. You want to make sure that you have a plan, again, to monitor for anticipated problems, and you'll want to describe kind of how they're going to be handled. And obviously, you may not know all of this at the onset of the development of the software or when it's first being used in an experimental capacity. But obviously, as things come up, you'll want to make sure that you take the appropriate time and pauses in your study so that you can address it and fix it and moving forward. In talking about privacy, I've separated confidentiality and privacy into two components. Privacy, we're looking at making sure you're adhering to HIPAA requirements, like who are you working with, what information are you going to be using, who's going to access the information. Of course, if you've got some additional populations that may be small and easily identified, you want to make sure that there's additional protections in place for those individuals or for that individual's data. Obviously, if you're working with sensitive data, HIV data, mental health, incriminating data, you want to make sure there's additional protections in place for that. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is talking about how your data sets are going to be maintained, how you're going to minimize re-identifiability. Anytime that you're sharing information or, you know, you're putting the show on the road, so to speak, you need to probably make sure that your protocol has considerations in place for data use agreements, BAAs, so on and so forth. So like I say, this is a pretty busy slide, but this is pretty much what we're considering for these types of protocols when we're looking at software protocols. Now, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the clinical investigation versus what a clinical evaluation is. So obviously, clinical investigation, this is where you're actually carrying out a clinical trial. You're testing one thing versus another, you know, you're doing that type of thing. Whereas a clinical evaluation is where you're starting to develop the product and you're looking to see if things are going to work the way you want them to work. In clinical trials, there's usually a research question. And you're looking at what works, what doesn't in treating humans. Whereas with clinical evaluations, this is really non-interventional. It's assessment of existing information. When you're looking at clinical trials, those types of studies are looking to establish safety, device performance, benefits, and effectiveness. Whereas with clinical evaluations, it's looking at can the software do what we want it to do? They may have some safety components, but they will also look at whether the benefits of use of the software outweigh the risk. And obviously with clinical investigation, it's looking at how you can develop continuous monitoring and updates over the time period that you're using the software. So now we kind of change gears and talking about the fun thing, the software's medical device determinations. This is a category that the FDA has on medical devices. They call them, you maybe hear them also referred to as SAMD. But in this sense, obviously this is after the IRB makes a determination that the software that you are using is a medical device. Then the IRB has to make the appropriate determinations as it relates to devices, whether an IDE is required or not. There's typically 3 categories that we can have this fall within too, and I'll talk about all 3 of those next. So it's going to be IDE exemptions, it's non-significant risk device determinations, and then significant risk device determinations. When we're looking at a study and we're making an IDE exempt determination, there's certain information that must be available about the device that the IRB takes into consideration. We have to make sure that the device that this is software, I should say, the software that you're looking at is something maybe that you're using that's diagnostic. That's usually the category in which the software kind of falls into. The sponsor will comply with applicable regulations in 21 CFR 809-10C. That the testing that you're going to be involving in the study itself is not invasive, and then obviously you're not using invasive sampling that presents significant risk to obtain the information that's going to be plugged into the software itself. And then the testing doesn't by design introduce energy into the body. And probably the more important component of IDE exemptions is that if you are testing software that you're not making any clinical decisions without confirmation of a medically established product or procedure. So you're not solely relying on the output from the software itself to make the clinical decision that you are relying on medically established product or procedure. Obviously, the software itself can do what the standard of care is doing, but again, we want to make sure that the protocol itself details that you're not relying solely on the software's determination to make some type of clinical decision. So in this situation, the IRB can make an exempt determination, IDE exempt determination. I'll inform you that provided that the study itself is minimal risk, these IDE exemptions can actually be reviewed through expedited review. So they don't have to go to the full board again, provided that they meet all of the regulatory components, meaning they're minimal risk, they meet one or more of the expedited review categories. Switching gears to talk about non-significant risk. So non-significant risk device determinations, as you've probably heard through previous educational sessions, this is a little category that the FDA has carved out, indicating that whenever a device is non-significant risk, that the investigator or the sponsor of that particular device doesn't have to go to the FDA to get an IDE. They go on to say that through the IRB determinations, it meets the abbreviated IDE requirements. So that's essentially what non-significant risk is, but in terms of the FDA designation. But further, when we're looking at non-significant risk device or software in this situation, the software itself can't be an implant. And you'll see a lot of nots and then ands in here. And those are really, really important because it's the combination of both statements that makes this particular component or criteria something that we need to have in place so that IRB makes the appropriate determinations. So obviously, software is not going to be intended as an implant. So this is just kind of a moot one, but it is criteria. Excuse me. That the software itself is not purported or represented to be used for supporting or sustaining human life and does not present a potential for serious risk of health, safety, or welfare to the subject. Probably not going to be in that category. This is probably the more important category is not for use of substantial importance in diagnosing, curing, mitigating, or treating disease or otherwise preventing impairment of human health, and where it doesn't present a potential for serious risk to the health, safety, or welfare of the subject, or doesn't otherwise present a potential for serious risk to the health, safety, or welfare of the participant, provided that a justification on how that particular software meets the criteria is provided to the IRB. Additionally, you want to put information in here that indicates that what happens if you're just solely relying on the software itself and what risk that poses to the participant, and kind of focus on those. That'll help the IRB make that non-significant risk device determination, saying that it meets the abbreviated IDE requirements. On the other hand, we have significant risk. And believe it or not, significant risk device is just the opposite of non-significant risk device. But I want to kind of highlight, obviously, these types of software are not going to be intended as implants, nothing that's going to be used to sustain human life or anything like that. It's probably this more important category 3 use may be for use for diagnosis, curing, mitigating, treating diseases, or otherwise preventing impairment of human health, and there's a potential for serious risk. In those situations, IDE is required by the FDA itself. Both non-significant risk device studies and significant risk device studies wherein you need to go and get an IDE, those need to be reviewed by the full board. So those don't qualify under expedited review. So talking a little bit about the potential for serious risk. I mean, obviously, a study using software can present risk to the individual. But when we're talking about risk, we want you to kind of focus on all of them, but namely those ones for misdiagnosis. So if you're using the software in this study, is there a chance that the software will fail and misdiagnose? There could also be inaccurate results or false positives. And ultimately, those can result in psychological trauma from inaccurate or false information. But probably more importantly is, and I've seen this kind of with a lot of like stroke patients or, protocols where you've got a patient and there's a suspected heart attack or something like that. And maybe there's some protocol in place, but there might be some software that's established to help those situations. So if the software can fail where medical personnel fail to initiate necessary treatment, that's going to be a very serious risk that we should be considering as part of that criteria for significant risk versus non-significant risk device determination. So again, those types of studies are not free of all risk and want to make sure that you include that information in the protocol. And then the last thing I wanted to introduce is this clinical decision support tools. So the FDA has another carve out, their intricate world, their clinical decision support software. They indicate that there's some software that can be used in healthcare and in research, but it has to meet some certain criteria in order for it to be considered a clinical decision support software. The software itself can't acquire, process, or analyze medical images or signals or patterns. The software itself displays, analyzes, or prints medical information normally communicated between healthcare professionals. It could be used something to communicate between healthcare professionals. And then the last criteria is that provides the basis of recommendations. So, and that the healthcare provider doesn't solely rely on, but like just again, uses the information to make final clinical decisions. And in those situations, that clinical decision support software can be used without all of those device determinations. So this particular link, I've made a link available onto the FDA's guidance, and it actually takes you to this nice little table here. So the next question is, okay, what at UT Southwestern, what are we doing to help you as investigators carrying out research? You know, our current EIRE system is limited in where you actually describe the information we need to make these determinations. So what we have done is establish or created a form. We call it Form TSAI. We say this is a form that's involving software, and the form needs to complete it. A separate form needs to be completed for each software that's being evaluated. And this basically gives us the information that we need, as I just discussed earlier, in terms of the protocol determinations that we have to have in place. So this first page is really kind of getting acquainted with what is the current FDA status of this particular software. Is it approved, cleared, or unapproved? If it's something that's been cleared or approved by the FDA, we want to know, are you using it in accordance with this labeling? And if not, we want to talk about kind of what are you now using it for? We want to know who's developed the software, because that helps us understand whether we need additional institution committee approvals such as ISAC or OTD. We want to know if you've already gone to the FDA and they've made determinations about the device or the software itself, we want you to talk about that or attach it to the application itself. We want to learn kind of what the current clinical workflow or evaluating the condition of interest is. So this is kind of referring to like the process of making clinical decisions. So, you know, a patient is seen here, then they go here and they have these tests done. And then based on the results of the tests, then, you know, a care plan is established, right? Whereas number 3 is kind of referring to the diagnosis. How does a clinician make diagnosis and treatment decisions? So it would be basically, you know, after we hear chief complaints and we do these types of scans or we do these types of testing, this is what the physician does. We want to know who's making that diagnosis. I know in some cases, nurses have protocol, like in emergency rooms. If a patient presents and they maybe have some chest pain and it looks like this patient is having a heart attack, I think the nurse has a protocol in place that they can give like a nitro tab, right? So again, who's making the diagnosis, who's actually doing the treatment in that situation. The next page is really referring to, okay, we want to know, if you're using FDA cleared software, you know, is there an update in the workflow? Who's using it? What's the output of the software determinations? What's supposed to happen? You know, so we want to look at all of that. And that helps us understand harms. That helps us understand kind of the software approach and things like that. We also want to know that if you're using this software, are there going to have to be any additional procedures that you do to validate the software? So I don't know, thinking about scanning images, AI that scans images. Are you going to have to now subject the person to another image to validate the findings of the actual software? So that's kind of what that's getting at. Then the next set of questions are kind of geared at whether you're using the clinical support decision software, that the carve out that the FDA says is not a medical device if it meets that 4 criteria. The next set of questions basically takes you through that. So are you using it? Is it processing anything? Is it acquiring anything? Are you just using it to communicate and ultimately make decisions outside of the AI? So that's what those set of questions take you through. And then the final page will take you through, again, a description of the software in plain language. Help us understand, you know, you all are scientists and you know all of these wonderful terms that you use and sciencey words that you use, but kind of help us understand like how, like to bring the language down a level, because sometimes people in my world, we don't understand like, state shifting and algorithm terms and things like that. So you might have to kind of like describe information in kind of layman's terms. But this also helps take you through the monitoring of the information, protocols that are in place to monitor for the safety of the participant, unintended access. It's all of those other components that we described. So in the end, this form is actually available on our website now. If you're asking the IRB to make an IDE exempt determination, you're obviously going to complete the device section within SmartForm, but you're going to upload this form to 6.7. If you're asking the IRB to make a non-significant risk device determination, this would obviously go into the non-significant risk device section of the application. And then obviously same thing for the significant risk device determination, go there with the documentation there. So ultimately, when you're thinking about AI software and things like that, you want to make sure that you're kind of evaluating like terms. Those really kind of make a lot of, they can make or break a protocol, basically make it go one way versus another. So these items may require IRB approval. Make sure that you understand definitions, that you reach out to FDA on their links about artificial intelligence, clinical support decision software. Is my software a device? I've actually had links on the next page to those particular websites. If you are doing a study where you actually are doing it like a clinical evaluation or investigation, you want to make sure that your protocols are included so that we can make the appropriate determinations. And as I mentioned before, just using the FDA tools for assistance. As I mentioned before, there's some references on this page and questions.
Hi, thank you, Mayed. Yeah, so we're gonna open up to our Q&A session now. There are some questions in our chat, so I'm gonna give you a moment to kind of get over there. And I do also invite the audience to type up and submit any questions you have at this time.
Okay, so the first question that I see on here is, can we use ChatGPT to generate patient-facing materials? Sure. Again, if you're not using ChatGPT to figure out if they can, if you're investigating whether ChatGPT can generate patient-facing materials that are meaningful, then yeah, you can use that. You can use ChatGPT to generate that information. The next question is, if we're using a software to establish randomization, is it necessary to disclose it in our protocol? If so, why? No, because that software itself is not a software that's going to be used that you're investigating. It's not part of the clinical investigation itself. So that software that we don't need to be aware of. So that's not necessary. And then we've got one that says, doesn't ISAC also evaluate the same things? Okay, so ISAC is there to evaluate a number of things. ISAC's looking at, they're looking at the purchase of things to make sure we're using funds correctly and making sure that we use our own resources before we actually go out and buy new software. But they're also looking at like risk to the institution. So if information is going to be housed in this particular platform or the software itself, they're looking at risk. They're looking at who can have access to the information. Do they sell their information? So that I think the institution is actually has prohibition in place for any type of selling of information. But we want to make sure that informed consent documents are then updated if it's allowed and there's any type of sharing occurred. So. Yeah, ISAC, they might look at the same things, but they're looking at them again from a different perspective. They're looking at it from an institutional risk, institutional resource use perspective, whereas the IRB is looking at human subject protections. When the HRPP forms go away and the new IRB system will be rolled out, will the components on this AI form be embedded into the new system? It will be, but it'll probably have to be in an iteration, an update to the system, because I know we're working very, very hard to get this program out to everybody fairly soon. Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you, Maya. Yeah, for right now, that is all we have. Let's just pause for a few moments, see if there's any more questions that come in.
And I realized I didn't have your ending page, and I'm so sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. We'll include it when we send out the slides. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm not seeing anything else come in, but as always, we're here to answer your questions. I want to thank our presenters today, Daryl and Mayad. Thank you all for attending today's session. The next Research Matters session is going to be held in May on May 21st. So have a great rest of your week, everyone. Thank you.